I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Marx. We could, but I'm not going to. But you got to give the devil his due. We say in English. You got to. Marx made some good observations. He was around in the UK. He was actually German. He was Jewish. His family converted to Presbyterianism, I think, and then he ended up in England. He was a very low resolution philosopher. He wasn't bright enough to be an actual professor. He tried a number of times, couldn't get hired by any universities, and he became a very angry, very resentful, bitter, as Peterson talked about, person. But he made some good observations. England, between the 1800s and 1850, was a horrible place to be if you weren't part of the aristocracy. The work, and then of course this was during the time of the industrialization, right? Starting to mass produce stuff. They needed workers. No, by the way, that's why you're all sitting here in rows. School system originally was designed to create people to work in factories or to work in the industrial sector who basically could read and write but not think for themselves necessarily. Just do what you're told, and so we'll just line you up in seats like this, talk to you, and get you to a certain point and then spit you out. So that's our Western education system in a nutshell. So Marx saw this, and it was the aristocracy, and then there was the bourgeois, as he called them, and then there was the proletariat, the worker bees, the guys who were just being, they would work in the coal mines, they would get black lung disease, they would die, nobody cared, they lived in poverty and filth, and alcoholism was so rampant in England during that time that they actually had what was called a penny gin. And they had little steps in the bars where children could come up and put a penny down and get a penny gin. So alcoholism was rampant. The life was so brutal. And Marx looked at that and he thought, it's not fair. And his rage and his anger was, of course, towards the bourgeois. Now, interestingly enough, there's a big difference between loving the poor and hating the rich, right? Marx did not love the poor. He hated the poor too. He despised them. They called them the deplorables. He despised the poor because they were so stupid. Why would they ever give their entire lives working for these rich, wealthy people? They are stupid. They deserve everything they get. But I can figure out a way to change it. And so, through a series, and again, he was not a very good thinker. You can write this down. There's a book called The Intellectuals by Paul Johnson. Have you read it?
No.
Yeah. And it's Paul Johnson is a British historian, really, really bright, very, very much an intellectual. And he decided, he took about 10 of the very influential intellectuals over in the Western world, and he said, what is their backstory? What would they really like as people? Yes.
Who is it by?
Paul Johnson, yeah. What were they really like as people? And so when you read the section on Karl Marx, this guy was he was really bad. But anyway, he came up with his idea of Marxism. And basically, it's the idea, I'll try to explain it as simple as we can. The idea is this, is you have two opposing forces, right? So in your culture and society. So say you have the rich and you have the poor. Now, what you try to do is you try to get them to come together, and through revolution, right? Through revolution, they come together and they'll fight, and then out of it comes a new antithesis. And then you do that again, and every one of those is progress, by the way. So you keep fomenting revolution, 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 and then one day, voila, utopia, right?
Wow.
Now that's basically Marx's philosophy. Now he got it from Hegel, and got it from materialism. He got it from Feuerbach when it comes to materialism. Yes?
What you said really makes me think about the Darwin and the evolution concept.
Yes.
You know, again, and
Exactly, yeah, that's exactly it, yeah, the same idea, well, they were all evolutionists, and we'll talk about that in a minute, how this came about. So, Marx came up with that idea. Now, here's probably one of my favorite quotes. I was a huge, and still am, a huge fan of Winston Churchill. I don't know if I read everything he wrote, but I read a lot. I even read his History of the English Language, which is like 1,300 pages, you know. And in the old days, we had these things called dictionaries. And Churchill's vocabulary was sensational. I mean, he was really a brilliant writer. He was a great politician too, but he was a brilliant writer. And he had some great quips. But his quip on Marxism was this. He said, you know, the inherent vice of capitalism is its unequal sharing of its blessings, right? So some of you have the rich and you have the poor. But he said, the inherent virtue of socialism is the equal distribution of their misery. So if you've ever been to an Eastern European country that's been under communism for a long time, you know that the miseries have been spread out pretty evenly, you know. So if you have your choice, I think most of the time we would probably choose the non-socialistic approach. Although I realize in Europe there's variations of this, but this would be true. He's talking about true Marxism on this one. Now this is one that not very many people know about, and I didn't know about it until I started hearing the term critical race theory. How many have heard of that? Critical race theory. Tell me what you think it means. Joshua, what do you think?
Oh gosh. I studied it, but it was a while ago. So
You're only 18.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a while though, so I probably need a refresher.
Okay, all right.
But I have heard it.
Okay. Rebecca, sorry. You guys shouldn't sit together. I get confused. No.
I'm the same as Joshua. I studied it for my exams last year, and I can remember what my page looks like. I can remember all of my notes, but I can't remember what they actually say.
And that's about it?
Yeah.
Okay. That's our educational system right there at work. Yeah. Daniel?
There's viewing people as being parts of different groups, which are either better off or worse off depending on which group you're part of, and therefore the belief that that the group that's better off should give to the group that's lower off.
Yeah. Or be taken from
Yeah.
Yeah, well done. It's the basis of what's called identity politics, where no longer is the individual. Remember back with John Stuart Mill, and they're thinking it was the individual, and that may have been the greatest concept that came out of either the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, was the idea that the individual was the most important thing, not the group, but the individual. And that's how we built most of the Western world, and especially in our constitutions that set out. You have individual rights, the government has individual responsibilities to make sure your rights are maintained. That was the social contract that we made, that people made to be governed. So that's why constitutions are so important, because that's what it lays out the groundwork and the rules for it. So, when I kept hearing critical race theory, and I thought, it didn't sound right. If you read enough, and I'm not a philosopher, trust me, I'm not, but I've read quite a bit. And normally if you've got a critical theory, it's the theory of it's an overarching theory. It's the big, grand narrative. It's the big story. But you don't, when it says critical race theory, the race shouldn't be in there, because that really brings it down. It should be a general theory. So I thought, well, I wonder if there is something called the critical theory. Now, so I Googled it, and instantly I found out. The critical theory came out of the Frankfurt School. And I thought, well, what in the world is a Frankfurt School? So again, tracking this down. Come to find out, in the about 1923 or so, there were a group of about 8 Jewish intellectuals. All these guys were Jews. This will be important here in a minute. There were about 8 of these Jewish intellectuals. Most of them were Marxists, but they came from different disciplines. So you had some philosophers, you had some theologians, but you had some economists, you had some psychologists. So they came from a bunch of different disciplines. And they came together and met at University of Frankfurt in 1923. And they would gather together to rethink Marxism. Because what they saw going on in Russia, and I remember Marx had his idea, and then it was Lenin who actually in the late 1900s, 19-teens, about 1917, 1918, fomented what? The Russian Revolution. And they threw off the king, and they started this, movement, and then Stalin came along. But by even 1923, like 5 or 6 years into it, these guys gathered together and said, something's wrong. This isn't quite right. This isn't what Marx had in mind as such. And so what they ended up doing was they came up with this, their criticism of Marx was, it was too general. You had the proletariat and you had the bourgeois. It had to be more than that. You need to break it down into individual social constructs, right? Individually, so we need to break it down by race, by gender, by economic situation, by whatever the category is. Get as many categories as we can, and then once we identify it, then we know what we need to tear down. So they were the ones that laid the foundation for what the French philosophers 50 years later implemented. So this was really important that the Frankfurt School laid the foundation for what's called the deconstructionism that comes in postmodernism. So finally, we'll take a break here. We just ran over a few minutes, but we'll come back and talk about Wittgenstein, and then we'll get into the postmodern guys, and then we'll move on to the real meat and potatoes of what we're talking about. So have a good break. See you in 15.